The land had not given anything back in 3 years. That was the truth of it, plain as the cracked clay stretching from the fence line to the old dry creek bed. The old farmer walked it every morning, boots raising small puffs of pale dust with each step, hands folded behind his back the way a man does when he is thinking hard and finding no good answers. The field had never been rich land, not exactly, but it had once been workable. It had once held corn high enough to lose a child in. Now it held nothing but hard-packed dirt the color of ash and a few stubborn thistles that even the wind seemed reluctant to carry away. His neighbors had opinions about this, as neighbors do. The man across the road had told him plainly, one afternoon, leaning on the gatepost, that the soil was spent and done. "Some ground just gives up," he said, squinting out at the pale field with something between sympathy and satisfaction. "No shame in it. Sell it off. Buy something useful with what you get." The old farmer had nodded and said nothing. His wife had passed 2 winters before, and with her had gone the second pair of eyes that always saw what he was thinking before he'd finished thinking it. Now there was only him, the field, the weathered barn that leaned a little more each season, and a farmhouse with too many quiet rooms. He had enough put back to last through another winter if he was careful. Not enough for two. He was not a man who complained. He had grown up on this same piece of ground, had watched his father break it with a mule and a borrowed plow, had learned the patience of farming the hard way, the only way. He knew that land was not always honest right away. Sometimes it made you wait. Sometimes it made you work for something you could not yet see. It was that belief, old, stubborn, worn smooth like a river stone from years of turning it over, that sent him one gray Tuesday morning to the county auction yard on the edge of town. He had heard about the pigs, 25 of them coming in from a farm that had folded down past the river, animals no one wanted because they were too thin and the drive had been long and the seller was asking too little, which in auction logic somehow made buyers suspicious. By the time he arrived and found the pen, he understood why the crowd had mostly passed them by. They were not impressive animals. Ribs showed through rough coats. They stood bunched together in the corner of the pen, heads low, flanks hollowing with each breath. One man walked past and laughed outright. Another shook his head and moved on toward the better stock at the far end of the yard. The old farmer stood at the rail a long moment, looking not at the pigs, but at the dirt beneath their feet, the way their snouts had already begun to work at it even now, rooting without thinking, turning up dark clods from underneath the pale surface. He reached into his coat pocket and counted what he had. He counted twice, to be sure. The bills were soft from being folded and unfolded too many times, the corners worn thin as cloth. It was not much. It was almost everything he had left after the seed costs and the last payment on the water pump. And he stood there holding it in both hands while the auction noise moved around him, the calls and the laughter and the shuffle of boots on dry ground. The pigs did not look up at him. They kept their snouts low, working the dirt the way pigs do when they are simply being what they are, not performing for anyone, not asking for anything. That was what he noticed most. Even half-starved and tired from the drive, they were still doing the one thing that mattered. They were still rooting. He had learned about soil the slow way, the way most poor farmers learn things, through failure and watching and the kind of patience that comes not from wisdom, but from having no other choice. His father had broken that field behind the house back when the old man still believed in it, and his father before that had planted it without much thought, taking what the ground gave until it gave nothing. Decades of that. Decades of dry seasons and hard plowing and crops pulled out by the roots without ever putting much back. The soil had gone pale and packed, almost gray in the summer sun, more dust than earth when you crumbled it in your hand. He had tried covering it with straw the year before. He had tried turning it with the old blade plow. He had hauled in what compost he could manage and worked it into the top layer by hand. None of it went deep enough. The ground was sealed over like a crust on old bread, and everything he spread across the surface just sat there, not reaching the dead layers underneath. But pigs dig. That was the plain fact he kept returning to. They do not dig politely. They do not scratch at the surface the way chickens do or graze it down the way sheep will. They push their whole faces into the earth, and they root, and they turn, and they work it up from below. And everywhere they go, they leave behind something of themselves, broken ground and manure mixed together. And after them, the soil breathes differently. He had seen it once as a boy on a neighbor's place, a ruined corner of a field that pigs had been penned in for a single winter. The following spring, that corner had gone so dark and loose, it looked like a different piece of land entirely. He had never forgotten it. The auctioneer had started working toward this pen now. The old farmer could hear the rhythm of the call picking up, the practiced urgency of it, the way a good auctioneer can make even a quiet crowd lean forward a little. Around him, a few people drifted over out of curiosity, not interest. Someone near his elbow said something low to a companion, and both of them smiled at the animals in the pen. He folded the bills once more and held them steady. The auctioneer reached the pen, and the rhythm of his voice shifted into something faster, almost musical. He gestured wide at the pigs with one hand, a showman's sweep that seemed almost apologetic given what he had to work with. The animals stood in a loose cluster near the far rail, their ribs faint but visible beneath dull coats, their snouts moving slowly as though tasting the air for something better somewhere else. The opening number came out low, lower than the old farmer had expected, and he felt a small relief settle in his chest, though he kept his face still. Nobody moved. A man in a green coat near the fence post looked at the pigs the way a person looks at something left too long in the back of a pantry. Another fellow laughed once through his nose and turned away to find something more worth his afternoon. The crowd that had drifted over out of curiosity drifted back out of it just as easily, the way water moves off hard ground. The auctioneer tried again, dropping his voice into a persuasive register, pointing out that these were young animals still, that they had years in them, that a person with the right setup could do something with them. It was the kind of selling talk that works sometimes on less experienced ears. Here it landed in the dust and stayed there. The old farmer raised his hand. A few heads turned. One of the men who had smiled earlier looked at him with something between curiosity and pity, the way people look at someone who bids on a thing they cannot imagine wanting. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid and called for more. Silence came back to him. He called again. The man in the green coat shook his head slowly at nobody in particular. The gavel came down. 25 pigs for a sum that left the old farmer with just enough for feed to last them a few weeks, and very little else. He stood still for a moment after the sound of it, the finality of the numbers settling around him. the way dust settles after something falls. The bills in his hand were gone before he had walked 10 steps from where he stood. He heard someone behind him, not close but not far, say that it was a sad thing to watch a man spend his last good money on animals that looked like that. The voice was not cruel in tone, only matter of fact, the way people in farming communities talk about hard luck when they see it arriving for someone else. He did not look back. He moved toward the gate of the pen and waited for the transaction to finish, watching his pigs through the rails, reading them the way he had been reading animals most of his life. The smallest one had good feet, solid and wide, the kind of feet built for digging. He watched it press its snout into the thin layer of straw on the floor and pushing almost instinctively, working even here, even now, against whatever surface it was given. The drive home took longer than it needed to. He had borrowed a neighbor's flatbed trailer for the morning, and the pigs shifted their weight with every turn, making the whole rig sway and complain on the county road. He drove slow, windows down, listening to them grunt and press against the boards behind him. It was not an unhappy sound. Pigs make noise when they are uncomfortable, and they were quiet enough that he knew they were managing. He had loaded them with feed in his pockets, handful by handful, letting each one take something from his palm before it walked up the ramp. They had gone without much trouble. That told him something, too. His land sat at the low end of a long slope, 3 fields separated by old fence lines that needed work, the wood gray and soft in places. The first field was the worst. It had been worked hard decades ago, overplanted, never rested, left to bake under summer after summer until the topsoil had shrunk away and what remained was pale and tight-packed, the color of old ash. Nothing had grown there of any worth in years. He had tried twice, once with a cover crop and once with seed potatoes, and both times the ground had returned almost nothing. The soil did not hold water. It did not hold warmth. It sat there the way exhausted things sit, with no energy left to give. He opened the gate to that field, and the pigs came off the trailer with more confidence than he expected. The smallest one, the one with the wide feet, went first. It hit the ground and moved forward immediately, nose down, working. Within a few minutes, they had spread across the near end of the field and were doing what pigs do when given open ground and no reason to stop. They pushed. They rooted. They drove their snouts into the hard surface and rocked their whole bodies against it, the muscles in their shoulders working with real purpose. He stood at the fence and watched. He had brought a thermos and he held it without opening it, not wanting to look away. The noise of it was something specific, a rhythmic tearing and pressing, the sound of hard ground being forced open for the first time in a long while. Even the dry dust the pigs turned up smelled different once it was disturbed, a faint mineral bitterness released into the warm air. It was not good soil smell yet, but it was soil that was moving again, and that was where good soil smell began. His neighbor from the west end of the road slowed his truck at the property line, looking through the fence. He sat there a moment, watching the thin pigs work the pale ground. Then he drove on without stopping. There was nothing unkind about it. He simply had no reason to stay. What he saw looked like a dry field and a collection of underfed animals, and that was all it was to anyone watching from the outside. The farmer uncapped his thermos and waited. The days settled into a rhythm that required little thinking and a great deal of patience. He woke before light, pulled on his boots at the door, and walked the fence line with his lantern before the sun was fully up. The pigs were always already working. They did not wait for permission or for warmth or for daylight. They followed some instruction written somewhere in their bodies, and they rooted, pressed, turned, and moved on. By the time the sun cleared the tree line at the east end of the property, they had already shifted the earth in whatever corner they had chosen for the morning, and the pale ground behind them was broken open into something darker and looser that held the early light differently than the hard crust around it. He began to notice the pattern in where they chose to work. It was not random, though it looked random from a distance. They circled toward the low center of the field where water had once pooled long ago, before the ground had closed over itself from years of neglect and dry heat. He had noticed that place himself years back, the slight depression in the land, but he had not thought much of it because there was no water there now, only the same pale, exhausted soil as everywhere else. The pigs were working toward it with what seemed like intention. He mentioned this to no one. There was no one to mention it to who would have found it worth discussing. His closest neighbor to the east had stopped waving from the road sometime in the second week, not out of coldness, just out of boredom with the sight. The pigs were still thin, still ugly, still rooting a field that showed no sign of improvement from any angle visible to a person passing on the road. What looked like progress to him, the loose-turned rows, the broken crust, the faint darkening where the manure had begun mixing into the disturbed ground, looked like nothing at all to anyone else. There was a woman who ran a small egg and produce stand at the crossroads 3 miles south. He stopped there one afternoon for a bottle of something cold, and she asked about the pigs with the friendly frankness of a person who had heard the story already and was not trying to be cruel. She asked if they were eating well. He said they were eating what the ground had to offer. She nodded at that the way people nod at an answer that is technically true but not encouraging. He did not try to explain further. There was a version of the explanation that sounded reasonable: the loosening of compacted soil, the organic material being worked in, the slow return of microbial life to dead ground. But it was the kind of reasonable that required already believing it was possible. To someone who had never watched dead land come back, it sounded like the kind of thing a man told himself when he could not admit he had made a mistake. He bought his bottle and drove home and went back to watching the field. The watching was its own kind of work. He understood that now in a way he had not when he was younger. When he was young, he had confused action with progress, had believed that a man who was moving was a man who was getting somewhere. The field had taught him otherwise. The field was teaching him again. He walked the perimeter every morning before the heat settled in. He stepped carefully along the edges where the pigs had not yet reached, feeling the difference underfoot between the untouched ground and the ground they had worked. The untouched sections were still hard as packed clay, the kind of surface that shed water like a roof sheds rain, the kind that cracked in straight lines when the sun hit it for too many days in a row. But where the pigs had been, the soil gave slightly beneath his boot. Not soft, not yet, but yielding in a way that meant something was happening underneath. He crouched down one morning and pressed his fingers into a patch they had finished with 2 weeks before. He pulled up a small handful and held it in his palm. It was darker than it had been. Not rich black, Not yet, but the gray-brown color had shifted towards something warmer, something that held together loosely between his fingers instead of falling away like powder. He set it down carefully and wiped his hand on his trousers and stood up. The pigs themselves had settled into a rhythm. They moved in a loose group, rarely more than a few yards apart, working an area until it gave up what it had and then drifting together toward the next section. They had filled out some, not dramatically, not enough to impress anyone at an auction, but the ribs that had been sharp and visible in the first week were less prominent now. Their coats had a different quality, not shining exactly, but less dull. They rooted with the focused patience of animals that had found their purpose, which was a thing he recognized and respected. He repaired a section of fence on the east side, where a post had begun to lean. He did it alone, tamping the new post down with the back of a spade, checking the wire for gaps. His shoulders ached afterward in the specific way they always did after fence work. A deep pull across the top of the back that told him he was not as young as he used to be. He made himself a simple supper and sat on the porch as the light went long and orange across the field. From where he sat, he could see the difference already. The sections the pigs had worked looked different in the evening light than the sections they had not reached. The color of the disturbed ground was visibly darker, even from the porch, even in the fading light. Someone driving past would not have noticed. Someone who had not been watching the field every day for weeks would not have known what they were seeing. But he knew, and he kept watching. The darker ground spread slowly, the way a stain moves through cloth, not all at once, but steadily, patch by patch, section by section. He watched it happen the way you watch something you have believed in before anyone else does, with a quiet and private satisfaction that does not need to be shared to feel real. The pigs had worked their way past the eastern fence line section he had repaired, and were now moving in a loose group toward the center of the field. He noticed they had begun to slow their pace, not from exhaustion, but because the ground they were entering was harder than the ground they had already turned. The soil there had a pale, almost chalky look to it. When he walked out to check it one morning, he crouched down and pressed his thumb into it and felt the resistance like pressing into old clay. It barely gave at all. He stood and looked at the pigs and did not worry. He had bought them for this exact kind of ground. The town feed store was a place where men gathered on certain mornings to collect supplies and, as often as not, to talk. He had gone in for a bag of grain and a set of wire staples, and while he was settling the bill, he heard two men near the back talking about the Hale parcel, the old bottom land 2 miles down the county road that a young couple had tried to farm 3 seasons running without much luck. The men were saying it had good water access, but the topsoil was thin, and the ground compacted from years of hay baling without rotation. One of them said it was a shame, because the bones of the land were sound. He listened, but did not comment. He paid for his things and walked out into the light and loaded the grain into the back of the truck. He sat a moment before starting the engine. He had heard that exact kind of talk before, about bones of the land, about ground that was sound underneath but hard on the surface. He understood something that the men inside did not say directly, which was that compacted ground with decent bones was not ruined ground. It was waiting ground. It was ground that needed the right kind of help. He drove home slowly, thinking about the center of his own field. He thought about the pigs moving into that pale, resistant soil. He thought about what it would look like in another 3 weeks if they worked it the way they had worked the east section. When he got home, he unloaded the grain and refilled the water troughs, and stood at the field's edge for a few minutes watching them. One of the thinner sows that had worried him at the start had filled out noticeably. She moved with a steadiness now that she had not had in the first week. She was rooting along the edge of the hard center section with focused energy, and he watched her push her snout deep and lift, push and lift, working the ground open one small patch at a time. He watched her for a long time that evening. The light came down low and orange across the field, and the shadows of the pigs stretched long behind them, and he just stood at the fence post with one hand resting on the top rail and watched. There was something in the way that Thin Sow moved that settled him. She had arrived uncertain on her feet, ribby and dull-eyed, and now she had a kind of purpose in her movement that was almost difficult to look away from. The ground was doing something to her, and she was doing something back to it, and neither one of them was finished yet. He slept better that night than he had in a week. In the morning, he walked the east section again before the dew had fully lifted. He crouched down in the same spots he had checked before, pressing 2 fingers into the soil, feeling the give of it. The difference was not subtle anymore. What had been pale and packed and almost chalky underfoot had gone dark and loose to a depth that surprised him. He pressed deeper, and the soil gave way without resistance, and when he pulled his fingers out, they came up coated in something rich and heavy. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger and felt the grit of it, the moisture still held inside, even though the last rain had been more than a week ago. That was the sign he had been looking for. Ground that held its moisture was ground that was beginning to live again. He walked to the edge where the center section began, the harder, paler ground his neighbor had laughed at most openly. He crouched there, too, and pressed into that soil and felt the difference immediately. It was still resistant. It would give a little at the surface, but went solid quickly. He stood up and looked out across the pigs working the middle ground, and thought about what another 2 weeks would mean if they kept at it the way they had. That afternoon, a truck slowed on the road. He did not recognize it at first. Then the window came down, and it was the younger of his 2 neighbors, the one who had laughed the sharpest at the auction. The man did not get out. He leaned one arm on the window frame and looked out at the field for a moment, without saying anything. Then he said the east end looked different. The old farmer said it did. The neighbor looked at it a while longer. He seemed to be working out whether to say more or just drive on. He chose to drive on. The window went up and the truck moved off down the road, and the old farmer turned back to the fence and watched his pigs work. He did not feel the need to explain anything. The ground would do the explaining, in time, the same way it always had for people who were willing to wait for it. He went and refilled the troughs and let the afternoon pass quietly around him. That evening, he sat on the porch steps and did the kind of accounting that has no numbers in it. He looked at what he had. 25 pigs still working. A field that was changing faster now than it had in the first weeks. A body that was tired but not broken. Enough feed left to carry them another 10 days if he was careful with it. Maybe 12 if he stretched the evening portions. He had stretched portions before. He knew how to do it without weakening them. He thought about the neighbor in the truck. The man had not laughed this time. That was something. Not much, but something. In a close farming community, a man who had laughed at the auction and then gone quiet at the fence was already telling a story without words. The old farmer did not need the words. He had learned long ago that the land does not announce itself. It simply changes, quietly and without ceremony, and the people around it either notice or they do not. The next morning he walked the full length of the field before feeding. He wanted to feel the whole of it before the pigs were moving. He started at the west end where the work was newest and the soil was still pale in places, then worked his way east. The difference became more pronounced the further he went. At the eastern third, the ground accepted his boot with a different sound, a softer give, the kind of give that meant something living was happening beneath the surface. He crouched and pressed his palm flat against it. It was cooler than the western end, darker. He could smell the change now, that particular depth that good soil carries, something between root and rain and old leaves, something that takes years to build naturally, but that 25 hungry animals had been pressing into the ground day after day until the earth finally began to believe it again. He stayed crouched there for a while. He was thinking about a season 10 years back when the field had given him a yield he had been proud of. It had been good ground then. Life had changed it, and hard years had changed it further. And what he had now in the eastern third was something that could, with the right planting and the right season, come close to what he remembered. Not right away. The pigs still had work to do. The soil still needed time. But the direction was clear, and he had learned in a long life that direction matters more than distance. He stood and walked back to the barn. He gave the pigs their morning feed and watched them eat with the same steady appetite they had shown from the first week. They were not thin anymore. The ribs that had been sharp at the auction were now covered, and the way they moved through the field had a settled, purposeful quality to it, like animals that had found their work. The county extension man came by that afternoon unannounced. He drove a truck with a seal on the door and carried a clipboard under his arm, and he walked the fence line with the measured, professional step of someone who had seen a great many farms in worse condition than this one. He had been called out by a neighbor, he said, just to take a look. Nothing official, just a visit. The old farmer walked with him. The extension man looked at the western two-thirds of the field first, and he did not say much. The soil there was still pale and hard-packed, the kind of ground that cracked in dry weather and ran off in wet. He made a note on his clipboard. He said something about erosion patterns and subsoil compaction, and his voice had the careful flatness of a man delivering a familiar diagnosis. Then they reached the eastern third. The extension man stopped walking. He crouched down without being asked, the way a person does when something pulls their attention before their mind has finished catching up. He pressed 2 fingers into the soil and looked at what came up on them. He turned his hand slightly, studying the color and the texture. He pressed again in a different spot. He picked up a small clod and broke it, apart between his fingers, and watched how it broke. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said it was good ground. He said it slowly, the way a man says something he wants to be sure of before committing to it. He said he had not expected this. He said the structure was loose and the organic matter was building, and whatever had been done here was working. He looked at the pigs moving through the far edge of the section and seemed to arrive at his own conclusion without needing it explained. He stood and made another note. This time his writing was longer. The old farmer did not tell him anything he had not asked. He answered the questions directly and without boasting. Yes, the pigs had been on this ground since early in the season. Yes, he had let them move through it on their own pattern. No, he had not tilled it or treated it with anything brought in from outside. The extension man looked at him over the top of his clipboard. He said he would like to bring someone else out, a soil man he knew from the university side, someone who studied land recovery. Not to interfere, he said, just to see. The old farmer said that was fine. After the truck left, he stood at the edge of the fence and looked at the two sections of field side by side. One pale, one dark. One closed, one opening. The line between them was not perfectly straight, but it was unmistakable. Even from a distance, anyone could see which direction the ground was moving. The soil man came out 3 days later. He arrived in a different truck, older than the extension man's, with a metal case in the back that rattled when he set it down on the ground. He was quiet the way people are when they are thinking rather than when they are uncomfortable. He crouched at the boundary line between the two sections and pressed both hands flat into the dark soil on the treated side, then moved a foot to the right and pressed them into the pale ground. He did not say anything for a long time. He opened the metal case and took out small glass tubes and a thin metal probe. He worked along the boundary for nearly an hour, moving slowly, collecting samples with the careful attention of someone reading a document. The old farmer walked behind him at a distance, not crowding him, answering when spoken to and quiet when not. At one point, the soil man held up a small clod of the dark earth and turned it slowly in his fingers. There were roots threading through it, fine white filaments from the last of the turned-up grass. There were small, dark granules mixed through it the way good ground always looks when it has been worked from the inside rather than the outside. He asked how deep the pigs had been rooting. The old farmer said they had gone down a hand's length in most places, deeper in the sections they returned to more than once. The soil man nodded and wrote something down. He walked the full length of the treated section before he said much. When he did speak, he kept his voice level, the way a person does when they want to report something accurately rather than dramatically. He said the organic matter in the treated section was measurably higher than the untreated ground beside it. He said the compaction was reduced enough to show in the probe numbers. He said whatever had been locked up in that pale dirt had been broken open and made available. He said it in plain language without decoration, but the meaning of it was not plain at all. It was the kind of thing that takes years to accomplish with a tractor and a bag of amendments, and it had happened here with 25 thin pigs and a season of patience. The extension man was standing back near the fence taking his own notes. He and the soil man exchanged a look that held something the old farmer recognized. Not surprise, exactly. More like the expression people wear when something confirms what they suspected was possible, but had never seen carried out so simply. The old farmer looked out at the field. The pigs were working the far corner now, unhurried, their dark shapes moving through the changed earth, the same way they had moved through it every day since early in the season. Steady, patient, doing the only thing they knew how to do. The soil man closed his notebook. The extension man tucked his pen away. They shook the old farmer's hand and walked back down the lane toward their truck, talking quietly between themselves. He watched them go. He did not feel triumph, exactly. It was something quieter than that. Something closer to relief, or to the feeling a man gets when he sets down a weight he has been carrying so long, he forgot it was there. His neighbor came by that evening, the same man who had stood at the fence in the early weeks and laughed at the thin pigs rooting through pale dirt. He came without his usual ease. He came with his hat in his hands and a different look on his face, and he leaned against the gatepost and looked out at the field for a long time before he said anything. He said he had heard what the soil man found. The old farmer said yes. The neighbors said he had not expected it. He said he had seen a lot of things tried on bad land, and most of them came to nothing. The old farmer said he understood that. There was a silence between them, but it was not an unfriendly one. It was the kind of silence two men share when one of them is working something out. The neighbor said he supposed those pigs had done something he would not have believed possible. The old farmer said they had only done what pigs do. He said the land had done the rest. The neighbor nodded slowly and put his hat back on. He did not apologize outright, and the old farmer did not need him to. What passed between them was enough. A man admitting he was wrong, in the way that men in that country admit such things, which is quietly and with a little difficulty, and with their eyes on the field rather than on each other. After the neighbor left, the old farmer walked out to where the pigs were settling in for the evening. He stood among them in the last of the light. The earth beneath his boots was nothing like the earth that had been there when the season began. It moved differently. It gave under the weight of a step in a way that meant it was holding something now. Air and water and the slow work of living things, where before it had been closed and hard and spent. He knelt and pressed his hand flat against the ground. The dark soil held the warmth of the day. It was soft. It was alive. He had spent his last money on 25 animals nobody wanted, and planted them in ground nobody believed in, and waited while everyone around him measured the distance between what he had done and what made sense. The field had answered for him. That was enough.